Hi, well, it's 7 o'clock, so welcome. I hope everybody's joined us who wanted to join us has joined us. Just to let you know, this webinar will be recorded, so it will be available to anyone who wants to review it. That will cover a lot of ground here today. So it may be something you want to look at again, or if anyone, any of your colleagues have missed it, then please let them know that it will be recorded and available to our practices. If you have any questions, then please enter them into the Q&A section. You should find the box at the bottom of your screen. So tonight is all about equine parasite control. It's a topic that's received an awful lot of attention over the last few years, exemplified by the Canter Group, which is a large VMD-based stakeholder group aimed at prescribers, and they're in the process of producing some guidelines, which should be published in July. And also Beaver, which have recently published the Protect Me Too toolkit on their website, which is aimed at equine vets, of course, and allows practices to adapt and use that toolkit to produce their own protocols and guidelines for anthelmintic use. So there are two main reasons why this is such a concerning topic. The first, of course, is resistance. And the resistance is now known, as we'll hear from Jacqui later, in Cyathostomins, ascarids, and tapeworms, to all of the three major classes of anthelmintics, as well as praziquantel, which is used to treat tapeworms. And with no new drugs on the horizon, we need to tackle this because we all know that resistance is fueled by overuse. Some of you may have seen an article in The Guardian earlier this week by Dame Sally Davis, who was the former Chief Medical Officer, really outlining the enormous risks to human health of antimicrobial resistance. But the same can be applied to equine health and relating to anthelmintic resistance. And that's one of the reasons why this is so important. The second, of course, is environmental ecotoxicity. There's increasing awareness that these drugs, which are excreted in feces of horses, are very toxic to invertebrates and aquatic animals. So the long and short of it is that anthelmintics are being overused, and we need to restrict the use of anthelmintics. And we need to adopt a diagnostic-led and targeted approach to anthelmintic use, remembering, of course, the importance of pasture management and non-pharmacological control, which I think Jacqui will mention as well. So we need to change our reliance on the use of anthelmintics. For example, we need to look at the use of moxidectin as a routine, which is given by many horse owners in the autumn in the hope that it eliminates encysted cythosome larvae. And we need to adopt a risk assessment-based way of looking at the need for anthelmintics and as importantly, the need not to give anthelmintics. So there's a massive bit of education needed both for vets and SQPs, all the prescribers of anthelmintics, and owners of horses, which will involve a massive amount of behavior change, which of course is a science in its own right. So tonight, Jacqui is going to give us an update on our current understanding of anthelmintics and parasite control in horses and recommendations. So for those of you who don't know, Jacqui is a vet. She's graduated from Glasgow. She has a PhD in parasitology. She worked for many, many years in academia based at the Mordaunt Research Institute, working on different parasites in different species, including parasite vaccine research and the development of the small red worm blood test. In 2022, she joined Austin Davis Biologics and is now, I think, the Director of Veterinary Science. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to Jacqui. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate that. So thanks for coming tonight, everyone. I'm just going to assume that you've got a fair amount of knowledge of parasitology, so I'm going to dive straight into anthelmintic resistance and why we need to take measures to reduce its further selection. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Helminth populations within animals, be it livestock, humans and horses, can comprise hundreds of thousands, if not millions of worms, if you take account of the parasites that are in hosts and on pasture, or even in intermediate hosts. And what has become clear, because these are very polymorphic organisms, often worms with resistance-conferring mutations are present at the time that products are first introduced or new compounds. And what happens over time with continued treatments, particularly all group treatments, is we apply this very strong selection pressure, which enables those worms with the resisting conferring mutations to survive treatment and to mate cycle after cycle, until we get to a stage where the worm population largely comprises parasites that are less susceptible to the drug than they were when it was first introduced. And that's when we detect resistance. And although nothing's really been done in horses, we know from work done in sheep, but the time we detect resistance in a reduced fecal egg count reduction test, the vast majority of the parasites actually contain these resistant alleles. So we need to avoid this. The reason we need to avoid any further selection is because there's no new anthelmintic compounds under development, as far as we're aware, for use in horses. And we have quite scary levels of resistance to the compounds that we have available in the common species that we have, particularly the small red worms or cyathostomins, as you know, have almost ubiquitous resistance to benzimidazoles, both here and abroad, with variable levels of parental resistance. It's particularly high levels of resistance in the United States, where they use a daily in-feed parental product to try and control parasites. And you can imagine that would lead to massive selection for resistance within populations. And over the last 10 years or so, we've started to identify resistance in cyathostomins as exhibited by a reduced strongyl egg reappearance period to the macrocyclic lactones. Parasitology also is a parasite that seems to be able to develop resistance quite quickly, with very high levels of resistance to the macrocyclic lactones. And last year we had the first reports of a reduced efficacy of both anti-tapeworm compounds against Anoplocephala. So in summary, we know that for the common pathogenic parasites that horses are infected with, we do have resistance. In some cases, there's a possibility of ubiquitous resistance to 2 out of the 3 classes of anthelmintics in small redworm populations, with the possibility of resistance as expressed by reduced ERP to macrocyclic lactones. And that's something that we have observed in stud farms as long as 10 years ago. In addition to resistance in these 2 common worms, we also have reports of reduced efficacy, particularly macrocyclic lactones and poundworms, as well as the anticestode compound resistance that I mentioned previously. So what we need to do is find a way to work with our clients in trying to get them to understand that treating horses in groups frequently with anthelmintics is not a sustainable way of controlling worms, because resistance is inevitable, in addition to the environmental effects and impacts that Tim just mentioned. And what we need to do is to step back and look at our epidemiology and life cycles of worms and devise ways that we can reduce that infection load on pasture to reduce the amount of worms that horses can pick up, so that we have less worms in less horses, so we need to apply less treatments based on the results of diagnostic testing. The good news is that, particularly in adult horses on unreasonably or well-managed pastures, we find that most adults do not harbour large worm burdens, and they don't require regular treatment, if treatments at all. And we now have a raft of tests available that we can use to identify those horses that do not need worming within those populations and those that do. And in that way, we can reduce treatment frequency in order to reduce selection pressure for anthelmintic resistance. And that's just summarised here in this schematic, where you can see where we have poor levels of pasture management, we have higher levels of worm contamination. For example, if dung's not removed and we get high stocking density. Pressure from the pasture in terms of third stage larvae or cysticercoids and erupted mites, for example, will be higher. Horses will be more likely to become infected and have higher burdens, so that if we were in to test those animals, either by coprological or antibody analysis, a higher proportion would test positive. More anthelmintic treatments would be required, and this would lead to higher selection pressure for resistance. If we go to the opposite extreme, where we have very good pasture management with, for example, daily removal of dung, low stocking density, groups of adult animals, infection pressure will be far less, less animals will be likely to test positive in the tests that we use, and less Anthelmintics will be used, thereby lowering selection pressure for resistance. And as Tim just mentioned, Cantor and the BVMS Protect Me Toolkit, which has just been published, have focused on sustainable control of parasites in horses by, first of all, promoting a risk-based approach, which I'll cover in a minute, and then finding evidence to support the other methods of control out with just using Anthelmintics every 6 to 8 weeks. And that includes management, such as dung removal, as I just mentioned, and other factors which I'll come back to in a minute. And then there's the promotion of targeting treatments based on testing, which includes fecal egg count analysis or antibody analysis, and very importantly to test using fecal egg count reduction tests for the effectiveness of the drugs that we use. So the first step when thinking about parasite control in equine populations is really to think about the risk of the individuals within that population, and the amount of risk that you determine will affect the sort of level of testing or frequency of testing that should be applied to that group, as well as the level of treatments and the products to consider for treatment. No one size fits all, and the risk assessments need to be sufficiently complex to address all the different epidemiological factors that might affect horses and levels of infection within any one group. But they've also, on the flip side, got to be sufficiently simple in order to enable them to be implemented practically, because if we make them too complicated, end users won't take up the recommendations that we make. The risk assessments need to take account of up-to-date knowledge, both about the parasites themselves and what we know from the scientific base in terms of resistance levels, but also the knowledge of the locale and the local factors within that population of horses that might affect their risk profile. And if we do that properly, we can assess the risk, we can use testing, and we can use improvements in management, for example, to provide achievable solutions that will then allow us to monitor the effects of those interventions over time to see if we can get better parasite control. Now, Tim and I have been talking about this for quite a long time now. How do we do this risk assessment, and how do we make it simple for practitioners out in the field to go into a yard or speak to someone over the phone and make some form of assessment in terms of the level of risk within a horse population for Helminth infections? And we've just sort of drafted up this sort of chart, which would be nice if we could put it into some sort of app or Excel format, where if you just scored horses based on your knowledge of them or what you gleaned from the owner, you could score them and then calculate the score based on the different risk factors that are assessed for the main parameters that we would need to investigate in order to assess the risk. And when we calculate these, come up with a total score, which would then allow us to categorize that horse overall as either low, medium, or high risk based on its scoring. And we've used the information in this table to try, based on knowledge that's out there in the scientific base, to try and put a sort of relative weighting to each of these factors in order to take account of them within the accumulated risk assessment. The system should also allow gaps to be highlighted, because you might not have an answer for every risk category. For example, what if someone doesn't do fecal egg count reduction test? What if they've not done it in the past? Well, we can put a score in for that. And again, that would be a recommendation that would be made following the risk assessment. And once we've generated the value and we've seen what the gaps are, we can then provide an intervention in order to try and reduce the risk to get that score lower. And from year to year, we can monitor the impact of the interventions that we suggest to see if the scores start to reduce down. And the way to get a measure of reduced scoring is to either improve management to lower the risk associated with that feature, and hopefully have a downstream effect on the diagnostic tests that we apply to move horses into a lower category. So I'm just going to spend a bit of time going through some of the evidence, background evidence, to why we advise what we do when we try to implement better parasite control in horses. And that will cover both management and diagnostic testing. What we certainly wouldn't recommend is for dung removal to do what we see here. This is one of my colleagues took this photograph last week in Northamptonshire, and obviously this person's been very good at dung removal in their paddock, but they seem to have piled it in the same field and the horse is using it for a bed. And probably brought stuff out the stables as well to get this nice nidus of infection within the field. So we've got to be practical on site when we're advising people about what they do to make sure that actually it makes sense from an epidemiological perspective and what we know about the life cycle of the worms. So we know that larvae from small strongyos, for example, can migrate probably about 12 feet at least. So obviously this would not be good for this paddock in terms of improving its hygiene or increasing its safety. And it's a big black box. We don't know much about unabated mites and how far they can migrate once they've eaten eggs from infected dung. I'm just going to start quickly on cyathostomins, just to sort of focus on how we control those and how we can address resistance. First of all, because these are the most prevalent and most common species that you'll encounter in practice, but also the species for which we have highest levels of drug resistance. As I'm sure you all know, horses of all ages can be infected with these parasites, but it tends to be that animals acquire a level of immunity over time, so that younger animals, i.e. those that are less than 5 years, tend to have higher burdens of these parasites. And there's also recognition that geriatric horses, and particularly those with PPID, have a propensity to develop higher burdens and higher egg shedding. We know that Anthelmintic resistance is common, and we know when these burdens build up, particularly to tens, hundreds of thousands, even millions of worms we've counted within the gut wall of infected horses, we can develop, animals can develop disease, particularly larval cyathostominosis, the colitis syndrome that's associated with the fast re-emergence of larvae from the gut wall. The causes of larval cyathostominosis are largely unknown. Specifically, we know that they're multifactorial. Obviously, they're associated with the level of burden that an individual will have. But research also indicates that an individual's own ability to respond to these worms is also associated with its risk of developing disease and the pathogenesis of the disease. And for these reasons, we can't really state a threshold for the development of larval cyathostominosis in terms of the level of larval worm burden that's in the gut wall. Cyathostomins are also associated with other conditions of the intestine, such as colic. So starting from the very basic, how do we go about controlling cyathostomins more sustainably? Well, we've been advising for many years that people remove dung from pasture, and that's based on the premise that it takes a certain time from the eggs that are excreted in dung to hatch and develop through to L3, which then migrate out of the dung pile. And we know, I'll come back to data in a minute, that will take at least 1 to 2 weeks in optimal conditions in the UK. Now, Rupert Hurd's a very good veterinary parasitologist who's actually based in Columbus in the States, but he did a sabbatical in Newmarket in the 1980s, and he set up this lovely study where he wanted to look at the impact of removing dung from paddocks on the levels of infection or pasture contamination in fields containing ponies. And what he did is he split them into different groups where one group of ponies were on paddocks where dung was lifted, I think, twice a week. And he compared that to 3 other paddocks where dung wasn't lifted, and animals were either treated with oxybendazole or ivermectin. And within these 3 other groups, he had yearlings, and he also had a group of adult horses that received the oxybendazole. And what you can see here is a substantial reduction in L3 that are harvested from herbage, plucked from those fields in the fields where there was dung removal and no anthelmintic treatment, in fact. Indeed, the ponies in these fields actually had the highest FEC in the study, but they had significantly less L3 on their pastures compared to those fields where the animals received either treatments and where dung was not removed. You can see here how high the levels of L3 peak in this group of animals that received oxybendazole. And even, so I'm just going to move you all, even where you have a persistent product, in this case ivermectin, and remember this was in the 80s, so the product was still very effective probably at that point, we still get this peak in 3rd stage larvae on the paddock slightly later, where dung is not removed. And even where adult animals are present, where egg counts are lower, we still get these increases, particularly sort of late summer, early autumn in L3 on these paddocks. And this is actually just down to 1 high shedding individual that caused most of this 3rd stage larval contamination. So this was a very good example of how effective dung removal can be in controlling the levels of infection in the environment. We followed that up with some studies many years later to look at what is the sort of timing of the development of L3 under UK conditions. And Yvonne Ramsey, that worked with Sandy Love and myself, she took infected faeces and put it onto clean pasture in various plots over the course of a couple of months in the summer. And she collected the grass surrounding each of these plots 4 times after they'd been laid. It involved a lot of work, a lot of grass cutting and a lot of larval recovery. And what she found that we would get a few larvae developing for dung within a week, and then there'd be substantial increases beyond that, 2, 3 and 4 weeks after laying down the faeces. So that gave us some sort of idea about how often we should remove dung from pasture in order to control the levels of infection. And of course, the level of development and the speed of development was increased when it was warmer and wetter. And you can see the sort of peaks that were achieved sort of in July in the faeces that were laid down at that time of year, a bit slower when it was cooler. So this is it. It's advisable to remove dung all year round, but particularly pay attention to frequent and full removal in the summer months. Again, a similar study, but this time we were looking at egg count analysis in donkeys in different fields where there was automated and manual removal of dung compared to no removal of dung on another 3 fields of donkeys based at the donkey sanctuary. And what we found that where faeces was removed twice a week with automated or manual means, there was a suppressive effect on the downstream egg counts. This is not larval counts in pasture, this time it's egg counts. So it's quite a rapid effect, even in terms of affecting the excretion of the animals that are grazing that pasture. And we found that either type of dung removal corresponded to about 20% compound monthly reductions in egg count compared to the fields where dung was not removed. So again, more evidence of the use of this method to control parasites. A follow-up study that we did a couple of years ago was to look at horses in different yards where there was either targeted or interval treatments, but we also looked on yards where there was dung removal and no dung removal. And what we found was on yards where there was no dung removal, we had a higher mean fecal egg count compared on yards where there was dung removal. And interestingly, when we treated these horses with Pramox, with moxidectin, which was effective at suppressed egg counts, we found that actually the egg counts came back faster and higher in the yards where there was no dung removal compared to yards where there was. We also took the opportunity in this study to look at these yards where they had been applying diagnostic-led treatments compared to the interval treatments, and where we were able to obtain samples from horses from the targeted treatment yards and set them up with PCR for Strongylosis vulgaris specific amplification. We didn't find any evidence of S. vulgaris on these yards or in horses that were based on these yards. It's shown here, and these are just these little bands here, the positive control. That's PCR product from DNA from an adult worm from Mark Nielsen, and then this is a PCR product from L3 from infected horses from the Norfolk Broads, which never get MLs. So there was no indication at this stage that there was an issue with large strongyles. This fascinating bit of evidence that was provided by Martin Eisker and his colleagues from the Netherlands many years ago showed the potential value of using ruminants in a sort of alternate grazing pattern to help control larval levels and subsequent infection in horses on pasture. And what Martin did over 3 years, he had basically 2 main groups of animals, and those in group 1 just grazed horse pastures all the time, but those in group 2 they grazed horse pastures up until July, and then they moved on to pastures that had previously been grazed from April to July by sheep. And you can see they took them through to the end of the season, and then they necropsied the horses 5 to 9 weeks after housing. And what Martin showed in this study, the substantial differences that he achieved in nematode burdens in horses that would graze the sheep, the part sheep grazed paddocks compared to those horses or ponies that were on horse-only paddocks. You can see the massive differences in burdens accumulated in animals that graze these paddocks over the 3 years of the study. Obviously, there's still some worms coming through, so there would need to be more measures around control in addition to ruminant grazing. But it just shows you the impact that even just have that pre-grazing period with sheep that can have on the downstream impact and burdens. So I'm now just going to move on to diagnostics that we can use to help in sustainable control plans. And I'm going to start with some information around fecal egg count testing. Now, what we do know is that worms and horses exhibit this negative binomial distribution, and that is reflected in their egg shedding patterns, which means in layman's terms that usually around 80% of the eggs that are deposited onto paddocks are only excreted by about 20% of the individuals. And that means if you do egg counts and set a threshold for treatment, that you will only end up treating 20% or less of those individuals at any one time based on the coprological analysis. And that can substantially reduce selection pressure for resistance, particularly any worms that are left, as I showed in the initial cartoon, in the non-treated animals will have a level of non-exposure and non-selection to the wormer, and any progeny from those worms that get onto pasture will then mix to dilute the progeny of worms that survive the treatment. And this is some work that we did a couple of years ago just to try and underpin the knowledge that supports that hypothesis. First of all, by showing that egg shedding consistency across horses in groups is very consistent over time. And actually, when you look at these large groups of horses over different sampling periods within the one year, we see this very stable effect or very stable pattern of egg shedding, with over 80% of the horses within the population having an egg shedding profile of less than 200 eggs per gram. And what we found in the study, that withholding Anthelmintic from horses with the negative to low egg counts from the start to the end of the season didn't actually lead to any significant increase in egg shedding. And this was across different yards with different types of management. This also supported findings that we'd made previously on UK stud farms, where we looked at 1,200 individuals and assessed their fecal egg counts from 22 farms, and showed that even on these farms where they've been, before the study was done, they just treated every 6 weeks or so with ivermectin or other anthelmintics. So it was a very strong interval treatment philosophy. This was before 2013. And what we found on these farms was that only 11% of the horses we tested, which were mostly mares, excreted 80% of the eggs that we counted. And 69% of the 11% that excreted most of the eggs were actually 1 to 4 years old, supporting the fact that actually younger animals tend to have less immunity to these worms and higher egg counts. And that's just exemplified in the graphs here, which show you egg per gram intervals on the x-axis and the frequency of the proportion of counts. And you can see particularly in our 2 to 4 year old females and our 2 to 4 year old males, higher proportions of animals in these higher egg count brackets. But even on these farms, there's still a substantial proportion of these younger animals which do have low egg counts, which wouldn't have been recommended for treatment based on strong egg count analysis. And you can see in the adult groups, particularly, this very low level of parasite egg excretion, with only 0.06% of the animals, 6% of the animals coming above the 200 egg per gram threshold. And we worked closely with these stud farms, and many of them have now gone off to, particularly in their adult mares, a fecal egg count directed treatment strategy for controlling parasites. So we encourage people to do egg counts, but we've really got to make sure that they do egg counts properly. Otherwise, it reduces the value that they will get out of the analysis. And Hannah Lester, who worked with me for several years at Morden, counted thousands and thousands of samples just to look at the factors that were a source of variation in egg count analysis. And we put all that work together, published many papers, but really wanted to just come out with some pragmatic solutions to help people in practice and horse owners themselves in getting the best value out of their egg counts. And what Hannah found that if you lifted different dung balls from a pile, you found that there was an over dispersion of eggs between the balls. So if you, in this case, if you'd picked up one ball and counted it, you could have had a 0 EPG count. But if you'd picked up another egg, another dung ball, and done just a typical McMaster analysis on it, you could have had a 200 eggs per gram count. And that obviously is important when you're making a decision to treat horses based on the threshold of EPG that you count within their sample. And what we also looked at was not just representation from across the dung pile, but the impact of both methodology of counting and mixing. And what Hannah found was that it was really important every step to mix the samples to overcome this over dispersion of the eggs across the dung pile. And this is just a measure of variance that she looked at in repeat samples from 4 horses, which were at Edinburgh Vet School at the time. And what she found is if you didn't mix the samples, particularly with horses with higher egg counts, you had this massive variance compared to if you mixed them. And actually, if you increase the volume of fluid that you counted in the McMaster chamber, so that you only ended up with a multiplication factor of 15 versus 50, you also could reduce the variance. So we put that together, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of these reviews and the sort of lay information that's resulted from them, is just to have some simple processes to apply when collecting and transferring feces for egg count analysis in order to improve or reduce the level of variance and improve the accuracy. It's also important to apply these same principles when you're doing fecal egg count reduction tests. In fact, it's probably even more important because what you're looking at there are probably relatively small changes in some cases in egg count between treatment and after treatment. And what you want to do is try and reduce that variance that can be controlled by your sampling method, your transfer and your counting method as much as possible in order to get a more accurate measure of efficacy. And again, this is just another article. I think we published it in EVJ maybe a couple of years ago. If anyone wants any of these papers, just let Tim know and I can send them across. And we just, based on quite a lot of the work that was done by others, especially Martin Nielsen and around the WAVP, is kind of set these what we hope were quite pragmatic and practical guidelines for performing egg count reduction tests in practice. Get as many horses as possible, apply all the facts that reduce variance in collecting and sending samples, use methodologies as sensitive as possible to count the eggs and to ensure that you incorporate the right number of horses if possible with the correct level of threshold. What was quite interesting in some of the studies that we did when we were looking at egg shedding was the fact that we tended quite often, particularly on the stud farms, to pick up these egg positive horses through the winter grazing period. And this was quite a long time ago. So I think this is probably even more of an issue as our autumns and winters become more mild and our larvicidal products become less effective. So this was just to remind me to say to you, when you are doing egg count analysis, if you are dealing with populations of horses that are spending a significant amount of time outside, is consider looking at egg counts sort of late winter, particularly even if they have received moxidectin in November, December, to start doing egg counts again about 8 to 10 weeks post-treatment if animals are outside, because we were getting indications that we could pick up transmission in some of the yard studies that we did. Another measure of resistance or early resistance is this phenomenon of reduced egg reappearance period, which we see with strongyles. So when moxidectin first came on the market, it suppressed egg counts for at least 12 to 24 weeks. It was a very active and effective anthelmintic against cyathostomins. And some horses, you wouldn't get egg counts to come back for about 6 months. I think partly because it's a very persistent product and the worms were very sensitive to it at the time, even in the face of having received ivermectin for a decade before. And what we do in the research field and what Tim's done here in this study with our colleagues is to actually look at the egg reappearance period every 2 weeks after moxidectin in groups of horses on different yards in the UK. And as we found in other studies, you start to see horses coming back with positive egg counts 2 weeks after treatment, probably not sufficient to show a reduction in efficacy because it doesn't bring it below 95%, but certainly some initiation of egg shedding in individuals, and that increases over time, so that by 10 weeks, many horses are starting to excrete eggs post-treatment. And importantly, we see this increase in the sort of what we call reduction in efficacy below 90% between 10 and 12 weeks. So again, when in the olden days, I'd say, oh, don't test after moxidectin for at least 16 weeks to 18. I'd now say, well, maybe you have to start thinking about testing about 8 to 10 weeks, depending on the background of what these horses have received. So putting this all together, this just is a little cartoon that gives you some guidelines for fecal egg count analysis about when to do them, how often you should do them, how soon after treatment you should do them with the different products. And usually I would say that over 99% of strongyl eggs that we get in the moment are cyathostomins, but we'll come back to that at the end of the webinar. Now, we know that egg counts often show poor correlations with adult worm burdens, and they provide no information whatsoever on larval burden. So many years ago, we started developing an antibody-based ELISA to detect cyathostomin infection, and that has now become the small red worm blood test, which is based on IgG response in serum to cyathostomin-specific recombinant proteins that we cloned and expressed from the 3 common species of cyathostomin. Now, this test is a test that should be used in low infection risk situations in order if you're wanting to use it for reducing Anthelmintic use, and to consider its use to look at horses that do not require treatment in low infection risk settings where owners would normally apply an all-group larvicidal treatment in autumn and winter. Because the test is highly sensitive for measuring low burdens of cyathostomins, it's useful to support a diagnosis of ruling out cyathostominosis in disease, such as diarrhea or other gastrointestinal disease cases, such as those that present with colic. The initial work that we did with different cohorts of horses, once we validated and optimized the test in the format that's now available from Austin Davis, was we looked at different groups of horses with different risk profiles. So we had a German yard cohort with mixed risk, a charity herd with high risk where there was poor pasture hygiene and the presence of horses with high counts, and then a university herd from the States, which some of the horses weren't grazing at all and some were on irrigated pastures, and they were receiving ivermectin every year. And what we found was this relationship where there was low egg counts or 0 egg counts, we had a higher proportion of horses that tested negative in the test, whereas if horses had a higher egg count, they were less likely in higher risk situations to test negative in the test. So on the basis of these results, which were published earlier this year, we designed the guidelines for the small red worm test for it to be a test that was only used for informing anthelmintic treatments in low infection risk conditions, where horses would be considered for a larvicidal treatment in the autumn, and to rule out those horses which had worm counts below 10,000 or 1,000 worms, because this is where the test works best in terms of its serum score threshold. So, for example, you tested a low infection risk horse in the autumn and it came back with a serum score of 12, for example, then we wouldn't advise treatment because it would have very low cyathostomin burden and would not require an anti-larvicidal treatment. Likewise, if it was a healthy horse in a low risk conditions where you would consider that it wasn't a lack of treatment would lead to contamination of paddocks, then you could take your threshold up. And if it was a serum score of 25, for example, you wouldn't need to treat it. And this is just the results of the test in different populations that we've been working with in practice over the last couple of years. This is a typical example of a low-risk group of 3 horses which are on graze paddocks all year, by and large, and where dung is removed every single day fully from the paddock. And these horses have now been tested every autumn since the launch of the test in 2019, and their serum scores have stayed below the 1,000 total cyathostomin burden threshold, and they have not received any anthelmintic treatments now for over 5 years. Likewise, when we look at larger populations of horses, this is a sport horse cohort from practice in the EU who submit blood samples to us. And what we've done is we've analysed their data and found that actually 62% of these sport horses, mostly dressage, show jumping type horses that don't see much grass, 62% of those were under the 1,000 cyathostomin threshold, with a further 19% below the 10,000 burden. And this goes against the sort of, I think, the dogma that most horses have large burden cyathostomin. If they're managed or they in very well in good paddocks, or they don't get much grazing, they don't see much in the way of cyathostomin, and they maintain low burdens and do not need treatment. This is very recent data that we've got obtained from a racing yard in the UK of 56 horses who have been getting regular interval treatments, all of the horses for many years, but they do have a daily 30-minute turnout to paddock that doesn't have dung removed. And what we found in this case that 48% of these horses did fall below the threshold for 10,000 worms, with 32% below 1,000. So hopefully we've been able to instigate a reduction in ivermectin or moxidectin treatments in this group by at least 48% to start with, and we've advised that they start to improve their management on the turnout paddock. So this is just a little circle of knowledge that brings together everything that I've said about cyathostomins in terms of their distribution, the risks associated with disease, the impact of drug resistance, and how we can use testing to try and effect a more targeted treatment approach alongside management. Now I'm going to take a quick shot now onto tapeworms. These are important parasites of horses. They were largely ignored for a long time, really until the 90s, I think, when Chris Proudman and some other groups across the EU were trying to understand how these parasites cause disease. And it became quite clear that they are associated with colic, and particularly the risk of colic being associated with infection intensity. Most horses have less than 100 worms, and a proportion of horses only harbour immature worms. But what we do know that in those horses that are infected with heavier infections, the parasites tend to live beyond sites of the predilection site at the ileocecal junction. A couple of studies have shown that they can cause colic in different ways, either by the sort of easy, I suppose, sort of pathogenesis, is that large numbers of Anoplocephala can cause a blockage at the ileocecal junction, leading to impaction. But it's also been hypothesized that the damage that the parasites cause, particularly at that site, result in gut wall thickening or mucosal inflammation that can lead to interceptions or impaction. And it's even been proposed that the worms, which are known to secrete an acetylcholinesterase, it's thought that it hydrolyzes acetylcholine, which can lead to effects on the contractility of the gut, leading to intussusception. Several studies have looked at the pathology and the pathogenesis of infection and shown that even burdens as low as 20 to 100 worms can cause quite severe lesions within the intestinal wall and cause significant damage to the enteric nervous system. And as I mentioned earlier, Chris and others showed this relationship between infection and intensity and determining the risk of colic. And he also, at this time, developed the ELISA test based on the detection of IgG to the 20 to 13 kilodalton antigen complex, which is purified from excretory products. And what Chris showed is a relationship between infection intensity and IgG responses to this complex. And he also showed a relationship between the risk of colic disease and the anti-IgG response to this complex of antigens, and therefore showed the relationship. And that was further supported by other studies which provided evidence of the relationship between infection intensity and level of or the risk of colic disease in horses. And what is concerning now with tapeworm is we're starting to get anecdotal as well as published reports of resistance to both compounds that are licensed for use against Anoplocephala tapeworms. There's been 2 reports from the States now, and we've had several reports from, sorry, my neighbour was just walking down the road. We've had several reports from parts of the EU of stud farms where they are having an issue with resistant tapeworms and horses dying due to impactions despite treatment with, particularly in this case, with praziquantel. That was just to remind me, this is not a resistance case. This is a case from France, a picture I was sent last week. And this is a horse that's come from a farm where they didn't really understand that you needed to treat tapeworm and were just given ivermectin to the horses. Tapeworms also show a negative binomial distribution, which means that all horses don't need treated all the time. And what we find is that many infections comprise immature worms and mature non-gravid worms. So egg count analysis doesn't provide information on the level of infection that horses have. And this has been borne out by studies in Italy, as well as a study in Germany that shows high levels of mature non-gravid and immature worms within individual horses. And we also know that the release of proglotid segments containing the eggs from the gravid tapeworms is intermittent. And again, that confounds the use of egg count analysis for detecting infection. So on that basis, the IgG-T ELISA was developed at Diagnostics in Liverpool, and it was subsequently superseded by the Equine saliva test, which is based on the detection of antibody to the same antigens. And both the saliva test and the tapeworm blood test, which is now available from Austin Davis Biologics as well, both show high sensitivity and specificity for detecting infection, particularly in horses with potentially pathogenic burdens of over 20 tapeworms, which on the basis of validation studies that were done using samples from horses for which tapeworm burdens were enumerated, it was found that no horses with a burden of more than 20 tapeworms was misdiagnosed in the test. The ELISA test don't provide an exact value for the number of worms present, but the scores are categorized into groups as low, borderline, and moderate high. Treatment is advised for those horses that fall within the borderline and moderate high categories. In terms of saliva measurement of IgG-T, we've shown that within 12 weeks of infection, the IgG-T levels within horses that are either on very clean grazing or are stable reduced down to low levels by 12 weeks after treatment. And that way, if someone wants to examine a horse after treatment and retest it to look at the effect of the treatment, then they can retest at 3 months. The data set, which now is over 200,000 Equisal tests in the UK, has shown that of all the horses tested, only about a third are reported as either borderline or moderate high. And that means that we save 2/3 of the treatments that would be applied when compared to a blanket treatment approach. So the use of the test has led to substantial reductions in the use of anti-tapeworm compounds here and also in the EU, where we're getting increased uptake of the test. And this again is just a little knowledge circle that I've produced for you. I can do these as handouts just to give you a bit of a summary of what I've covered tonight in terms of the risk that's related to burdens of tapeworm, how management's important in its control, and the issue of drug resistance, and how we can use diagnostic testing to help inform on the need to treat or not to reduce the use of anthelmintics. A final thing I thought I would bring up, because a couple of people have asked me about this, is if we promote less use of anthelmintics, will there be the potential for re-emergence of the large strongyle Strongylosis vulgaris? And I think this is something that we need to be wary of and aware of for the future. As long as 12 years ago, Martin Nielsen showed that when he did a study in Denmark, where they'd been applying diagnostic-led treatments for several years due to EU regulations, when he examined Strongylosis vulgaris using PCR and larval culture on premises that applied fecal egg count directed treatments and compared those to yards where horses were wormed several times a year, he found there was a significant association between the presence of Strongylosis vulgaris and the application of fecal egg count directed treatments on particular yards. And this was especially the case on breeding farms with the young horses. So this is something that we'll need to be aware of as we go forward, and we encourage people to use anthelmintics less, is to always keep in our mind these negative sequelae that may arise. Certainly the work that's been done subsequent to that in this country by us and by Martin in the UK hasn't really shown that there's this higher level of Strongylosis vulgaris in terms of detection of larvae based on culture and dung, or by PCR screening of DNA from eggs from feces from these different yards. Martin's also developed an antibody-based ELISA to detect infection, and he's found a higher prevalence in studies in the States and in Germany when applying that ELISA to detect Strongylosis vulgaris infection. However, I must say that the test specificity isn't validated for that test, so it could be that there's some cross-reactivity with other species such as Cyathostomins. It remains unknown, similarly to Cyathostomins, is what extent horses harbouring S. vulgaris are at risk of disease and what sort of burdens associated with that, but it needs to be something we're aware of going forward. If you are dealing with yards where you've got much reduced use of anthelmintics, you can do larval culture through a parasitology lab for them to discriminate the third stage larvae of small strongyles from large strongyles. And there's the option going forward for us to develop a PCR to detect this species in egg samples harvested from infected horses. So I'm just going to finish up now. Sorry, that was a very rapid gallop through tapeworm and large strongyles, just to try and bring all this together. So where do you start? Well, you should always start with a risk assessment. You should look at the yard or the farm, at what they're doing, look at the individual horses themselves in terms of their age and their comorbidities, for example, as well as look at the management and the treatment history for those groups of animals, and then start to apply diagnostic testing then to get more information about who's harbouring what and how much shedding is going on. And this sort of simple cartoon is an attempt by me to try and take you through that in a sort of calendar basis. So again, fecal egg count should be always the cornerstone of nematode control programs. The recommended treatment threshold at the moment is 200 EPG, but you could consider increasing that to a 500 egg per term in low risk populations. You should always consider what the anthelmintic sensitivity is if you don't know it when selecting the product to use based on history. But in the summertime, ideally do a fecal egg count reduction test to test the efficacy of the products that you're advising on that particular in that particular group or yard. In the spring, it's advisable to tapeworm test, and a spring test will allow you to identify those horses with burdens which will be excreting cestone eggs and contaminating paddocks, which will then infect the intermediate host or repeated mite during its optimal activity and transmission period. So you can imagine if their eggs are going out here, this is where the mites are really active. Therefore, you're going to provide a source of infection for those mites for the cysticercoids to develop to infect these horses later on in the summer. Again, fecal egg count midsummer to treat those horses that need treatment to reduce egg shedding, but consider doing an fecal egg count reduction test at that time. And then depending on the product that you use, sort of 6 to 10 weeks later, do another fecal egg count test to see if any other animals have either come back quickly after that, if they've been treated at the last egg count, or whether animals that weren't shedding at sufficient levels to receive treatment earlier on are shedding at higher levels. And then as you move into the autumn, consider a tapeworm test to identify those individuals that have, over the grazing period in the summer, accumulated tapeworm burdens, which might put them at risk of colic, i.e. higher burdens that would be considered pathogenic, and then treat those animals that are positive in the test. And then in low risk situations, where people are going to consider using a larvicidal anthelmintic, consider using the small red worm test to count out those horses that don't require treatment due to a low cyathostomin burden of 10,000 or 1,000 or less worms. And always discuss with your client and make an assessment about the management procedures that they do, and check what they do with their dung, because we found that so many times people say, oh, I remove dung, and then they do the strangest things like it, as you saw in that earlier photograph, putting it in the middle of the field. And thanks for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Jacqui. That was great. It's a fantastic update on parasite control in horses and where we are at the moment. We have a few minutes left. If you're okay, I've got a couple of questions come through, if you're happy to take these.
Sure.
Firstly, Chloe's asked, can you run through what the best practice for quarantine is?
I knew someone's going to ask that. Well, you have options, and I always say you've got options. So the simplest option is to obviously don't put the horse out onto a field and keep it in a stable and treat it with the most active agents against all the worms that are potentially in that horse. So that would be a Pramox treatment. That would be what we used to recommend in the days of yore. And in that way, you would hope that you would kill most, if not all the worms, but most of the worms that were susceptible to those compounds. Now, you should probably take a more informed approach now than that. And at least one thing you could do was do an equisal test to see if the horse has got a tapeworm burden. So that's going to give you information on its risk profile in terms of, is it susceptible to tapeworms? Has it got tapeworms, and do I need to treat for them? And also you could, if it came from a low risk situation, you could apply the small red worm test, but you could apply a moxidectin test, moxidectin, and that would hopefully be the product that would get most stages and most species of worm. And I would probably, ideally in an ideal situation, do an egg count reduction test when you're based. So take an egg count when the horse comes in. If the egg count is negative, you could still apply the moxidectin if you considered a risk of larval stages. If the egg count is positive, then you could give the moxidectin and then do a 2-week post-treatment egg count. That's what I would do. And I would keep it off, once it's been treated, I would keep it off grass for 72 hours as well.
Okay, leading on from that, Imogen's asked, what are the current recommendations for dosing and moving pasture? Is there a holding period post-dosing before moving to a clean pasture?
Well, there's different reasons to do these things. So first of all, there's the environmental effect. So obviously, I would wait at least 72 hours in terms of putting a horse onto pasture, which has had a macrocyclic lactone. There's no real evidence basis for the dose and move. We used to not recommend putting horses on a paddock and then moving them to a clean paddock, particularly because you were going to leave the dung on that paddock and then you would only have resistant alleles left. So in an ideal world, I would say you should poo-pick all paddocks so you could just dose and move. What I would do is I'd do an egg count and I'd do a risk assessment of which horses need treated and which horses don't need treated, and then I would treat the horses at over 200 eggs per gram, and I wouldn't treat the horses that were under 200 eggs per gram, and then I would move them. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Chloe's also asked about the small red worm blood test, but I think you've covered that in your webinar. Another question here about the HHP and when are we going to change that to a risk assessment approach? Well, the answer is it's work in progress. We're working on that at the moment. I was also asked if you could comment on the most effective treatment for pinworm.
Oh. There's no effective treatment for pinworm. So the most effective treatment for pinworm is scrupulous hygiene. I've dealt with a few cases, particularly in some charities over the year, and the Anthelmintics, I think, is difficult to get high efficacy anyway because of the position where the tapeworms live, particularly the females migrating in and out from the perineal area. And what it really requires is identify the horses that have got pinworm eggs or pinworm infections, treat them obviously, maybe with pine and tail because of the resistance levels that's shown in macrocyclic lactones, but also really ensure that that horse is clean. Perhaps place some Vaseline around its perineum once you've cleaned it so the females don't stick and the eggs don't stick to the perineum. Plait up its tail, and then with a horse approved disinfectant, you have to go round its stable, its manger, its gate, its stable door, its fence, and its gates. Wherever that horse could have scratched and left those resistant eggs in the environment has to be scrupulously cleaned, and probably to check all the horses regularly to make sure there aren't any other shedders. It can be a literal pain in the bum to get rid of if you're one of these unfortunate yards that has a pinworm problem. I would take at least 3 tape tests per horse just to try and reduce the sort of false negative results that you might get. But there's not really an easy solution that involves drugs. It really is all about the management and the hygiene in the environment. Don't allow any sharing between individual horses of brushes or other grooming equipment or rugs and things like that.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think we're running out of time. So thank you so much, Jacqui, for a fantastic webinar. It's been a really helpful, informative time, and I'm sure we'll raise lots of questions. So if anyone has any further questions, please send them to me and I can forward them to Jacqui or whatever. Yeah, just wind this up and thank you so much. And hopefully you all found this useful, and we'll speak soon. And this webinar will be recorded and available if you want to review it again. Thanks so much.
That's great. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.